Okay, thanks for this very charming introduction. I have titled my presentation, Penny is Awesome. Why I've done that will become clear in due course. My presentation shows 4 of our own projects where, for better or for worse, we try to, which are about the workplace, and for better or for worse, we try to, in a way, design our way out of the advent of the digital. Some of the projects, one in particular is an example of that, but also out of new labor laws as they become increasingly prevalent, which in turn also have to do with the digital. But before any of that, I would like to start with a few observations about how the workplace has transformed over time. This is the office as we knew it in the 1950s. If you look at that image with contemporary eyes, you'd probably see a highly regimented and possibly slave-like conditions. But believe it or not, this was a creative space in the 1950s. It is only the drawing boards at the back of the image that betray that this is actually an architect's office. I believe it's the office of SOM in Chicago, but the internet is not conclusive about that. But let's assume it is. So that was creative space then. This is creative space now. This is the Office of Upcycling Design in New York. And I think what is funny is that in contrast to the previous space, this space does the utmost to deny any notion of work as work. In this image, work is fun, and I'll go on. And I had no idea of the circumstances, no real idea of the circumstances I would be giving this presentation in before I kind of put together this slide presentation. But anyway, the work process is now today primarily, I think, a form of being socialized. Brainstorming is our favorite activity, putting random thoughts on random sticky notes on a random wall, almost like, and this takes the whole process a step further, almost like playing a game instead of working. And it's like the work week has transformed into a perpetual weekend where in kind of family and cozy situations we conduct something which vaguely reminds us that we're working. It's strange. In putting together these slides, I had a random association. This is a magazine called Boyzone from the 1950s. It is a magazine that actually focuses on leisure activity for youth, but with the primary motive to convey them to convert them to Christianity. And I've always wondered to what extent do contemporary spaces try to do a similar thing, convey an ethos, not necessarily of Christianity, but of the ethos of major corporations. This is a kind of interesting garden, interior garden of Eden equipped with satellite dishes, I believed. And the interior of Facebook's headquarters is like has the layout of a large interiorized camping ground. Once again, the association is primarily with leisure, not with work. And of course, a campground is exclusively populated by nice people, as you can see clearly here. Nice people who spend their days writing pleasantries to each other on the Facebook wall. Penny is awesome. I think the strange thing is, this is again the same Facebook headquarters I showed earlier as an exterior view. It's essentially a shed. It's essentially a warehouse similar to this warehouse that, in a way, through a thick layer of vegetation, Frank Gehry angles, etc., tries to disguise the notion that it is a warehouse, but a warehouse it ultimately is. And I've always wondered whether both the imagery and such iconography serve to conceal actually a reality which is much grimmer. We all know how organizations like NSA use Facebook and Google to keep close tabs whenever we exchange less cozy messages to each other. And I even wonder sometimes whether the cozy messages and the friendly messages are a product of the fact that we know people are watching. But anyway, Facebook Data Center, Fort Worth, Texas. This is the interior. And the interesting thing, it's an interior where also in a way work, I think, happens, but work happens in the absence of people. They are in the leisure conditions. But the strange thing is, if you convert this image into black and white, it becomes strangely reminiscent of the condition that in the 1950s was populated by humans. I don't know what to make of this, but that curious analogy isn't just limited to interiors. This is a data center in Jersey City in America. Take a good look. This is OMA's headquarters in Rotterdam, and where some might actually be happily enjoying the spaces of leisures, there are others who in a way still work in these kind of conditions that have meanwhile been abandoned by others. This is our office in Rotterdam. Please permit me this slightly autobiographical excursion. This is our office, a very regular generic building in a generic city, Rotterdam. This is what work looks like in our office. Again, I think this is what work looks like in a lot of places, even places that do not profess to be creative. This is what our leisure condition looks like. A tiny balcony that has survived the smoking ban in our office, one empty chair. And this is, in a way, us at work. This is work at our office. This is people in our office producing a big model. And it's kind of quite funny for me that those conditions are in many ways reminiscent and similar to the conditions that happen in other creative industry. This is a studio of a major fashion corporation, and this is a merger of the two images, where it's almost impossible to discern where the architecture ends and the fashion begins. This is another one that takes that notion even to a greater extreme, and I think the fundamental arrière-garde nature of our office actually puts us in close touch with the vast majority of creative sectors who actually do not live in a camping ground, and even permits us in the real world to work for them. This is a commission we acquired for G-Star. These are also actually images made we used to acquire that commission, where as a kind of method acting we said, we are like you. So therefore, please give us a job. They fell for that. This is, interestingly, their site. This is the edge of Amsterdam, an industrial site along the circular motorway around Amsterdam, a simple rectangular site. The site was supposed to harbor four of their dispersed operations over the city and unite them under a single roof. This was the metaphor they used themselves. It's a big hangar for, I believe it's for Boeing, where essentially a single space had a lot of kind of micro-ecologies where various parts of the work was conducted. And in the middle was a kind of a big monument to the collective aim of the various micro-ecologies. We took that quite seriously. This is our building. It's a long linear building that straddles the motorway, a kind of big window frame that almost displays the work process as a billboard for the company. There's an open space in the front which can be closed quite literally by hangar doors. So that looks like that, then it's closed, and then that's extra space where more of the informal processes are allowed to unfold. That's in a way the G-star activity in that space. That space can be opened and become the host of the home of a fashion show or even a pop concert directly displayed to the highway. This is a drawing drawn in the typical advertisement style of G-star. This is the real building. This is a photo of the interior of the building. I'm very sorry, this was taken shortly before the opening, and there are no people in our building either. You know, at risk of affirming the traditional notion of an architect who is not interested in people, I apologize. That's structure, etc. Tiny little ateliers boarded off in the big space. I'll go on. I'll be very brief with the rest until I get to Axel Springer. This is another project for office space, actually designed for bureaucrats, the officials of the Rotterdam municipality, in an old hybrid block, partially built in the 50s, partially built in the 70s. It was the offices from which the reconstruction of Rotterdam after the German bombing was conceived. An interesting open plan office. The space had to double as a hospital shortly after the war because there was a shortage of hospitals. Any office space was a hospital as well. This is the boardroom with the plan of the reconstruction of that. But in the 1970s, that space had essentially been butchered, transformed into this space, a corridor with cellular offices. That was the sacred cow of office space at the time. A lot of asbestos in the ceilings, probably also in the walls. Our project, in a way, foresaw, at request, in the elimination of the 1970s part, reconstructed a big steel structure in the center with open plans, offices, and atriums. You're going to hear the office of SOM reappearing in slightly more humane conditions. That's the thing. The interesting thing was that where the existing building had an enormous corridor and essentially cellular offices for private meeting space, it was here the collective spaces that became walled off in the context of an open plan, sometimes made peculiar, as you can see here. Breakout spaces, and then big atriums where actually the structure of the building was revealed, almost like that part of the building was unfinished. A big column-free space at the ground floor for the reception area. Here you look outward, and here you look at the building from the street in Rotterdam. Another building for a ministry, a building from the 1980s with very big atria on the interior. Essentially, the whole building presumed very dense conditions around it, so the view became essentially inward instead of outward, kind of botanical gardens with the coldest day would become in the winter was 10 degrees, the hottest 31 in the summer. We carved part of the atrias on the north in a separate compartment, reducing the fluctuation of that temperature and allowing people to actually enter the atriums, make the atriums big stairwells to connect offices. In a way, central corridor moved to the edge so that it was opened, offices opened up. So again, this condition became this condition. We somehow presume, and maybe that's a strange notion, that human happiness is directly proportional to the exposure to daylight. The head of the building is opened up because there was a corner room and actually a big sort of United Nations meeting room in that same block. I would like to talk in a bit more detail, and that's the last thing I would like to show about the Springer campus we're making for Berlin. Quoted by somebody, a palace to lure the elite of Germany's digital bohemia to its compound in Berlin. Very well put. He seems very content to come out with this. What it is, this is actually a combination between a traditional office and a new office. A series of office floors conceived as a series of terraces facing a valley on the interior, with a section which is then mirrored on top, so that the whole building in a way has a huge, not vertical but horizontal atrium, which also permits a view to the surrounding. Those are the conditions in that atrium. That atrium also essentially presents the whole work process aggressively to the outside. Interestingly, the building is directly adjacent to Springer's current location, and thereby almost inevitably very much a comment on the type of space they had so far. But it's also quite interesting is that building with its atrium, with its valley, is on the former trajectory of the Berlin Wall, where there used to be a wall, there is now a void, and that void sort of travels through the valley of our building to link up with the void on the other side. Here you see the Springer campus and our building in a way that gives shape to that diagonal. The building has a lot of public spaces. Public spaces are not limited to the ground, but in a way, in a kind of 3 steps rocket, travel their way up to the building, so that actually the public can enter all of the building and have public access even to the roof, thereby exposing the media process actually to a public physically, where it can enter. That same thing is also the mechanical smoke extract, but hardly interesting. But anyway, what is curious in the case of Springer, that of course the Axel Springer concern we know primarily for their printed media, but also the Springer concern is making the transition to the digital. And part of the brief of this building was how to in a way shape that transition to the digital and what effect it would have on their office. This is a statistic that essentially shows the money made from digital and print media, where recently the two almost in a way entered a situation of parity, which in a way begged the question there quite literally between a formal office and an informal office. And although our building and its layout allow for 100% formal and 100% informal office, we chose in a way to locate the informal parts, which are related to digital media, to the atrium, in a way to create a kind of physical, real experience of collectiveness and togetherness in the realm of the media that foster individuality and remoteness almost by definition or by the nature of their technology. So that is then the exposure of the terraces onto the atrium, the informal offices kind of spilling out like rubble into that valley. That's a view from the outside. And this is a view from the facade, which is a glass facade, essentially with a kind of charcoal-like frit on top of it, almost like it's directly exported from one of Mies' drawings for the Berlin competition. But those are our humble attempts to articulate something of which the complexity obviously exceeds that of architecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Renier. Our second speaker is Paloma Strelitz. While I introduce you, are you comfortable here? Maybe we should all move a bit.
Don't move, then
yeah. But maybe...
I'll angle myself around slightly.
I was told in Austria, if you sit at the corner, you'll get a bad mother-in-law, so that's dangerous. I want to make sure that is...
Thank you for...
And I'm responsible then, you know, you get emails. And so Paloma Strelitz is an architect and co-founder of the multidisciplinary collective Assemble, with 17 others. Maybe that's something we should talk about, how you work with 17 others for afterwards. Assembly is working across architecture, design, and art. They started collaborating in 2010, and in 2015 they were awarded the Turner Prize for their community project Granby 4 Streets, a kind of communal a project that renovated houses in a deprived area of Liverpool. Lucy is nodding, so you know the project. That's good for a moderator. Okay.
There was a huge thing that when they went in.
So in this deprived area of Liverpool, in collaboration with its inhabitants, and obviously preventing the demolition. This year, the Architekturzentrum in Vienna presented a survey show, How We Build, and yeah, looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. So I'm starting with a slide which says a factory as it might be. And it takes its name from William Morris's 1884 article, which imagines the ideal factory as one where work and leisure and education are combined. And so this image is from a project that was done between Assemble and Granby Workshop, which is an architectural ceramics manufacturer we've established, along with collaborators, and explored how one machine can be used as a creative tool on a production line aiming at endless variation. I want to talk today about alternate spaces of knowledge, considering both their cultural and creative value, and also the tools they can equip us with to challenge the status quo and conceive of new realities. It's a very broad theme, but one that has significance across the spectrum, from the way we discover to play in childhood to the spaces we continue to learn in as adults. So again, I'm trying to sort of compress quite a lot into a short space of time, but also through the lens of many of our projects. So as a studio, I think we feel that contemporary life can feel very disempowering, especially when the button to do something correctly.
No.
Just like this. Isn't it? Let's just pause for a sec so we get working.
I have no joke.
You have a presentation.
So no.
Nobody wants to hear my jokes.
Does anybody?
Strange, right? Because
They're there, though.
It's working.
no,
Just the first two.
I can keep speaking.
I'm very sorry.
It's okay. Oh, I know what the issue is. It's on the last slide. We need to go back to the sound.
Oh, it's coming.
Alles klar, alles klar.
There we go. Classic. I have to admit that's happened once before. Resident hazard. As a studio, we feel that contemporary life can feel very disempowering, and so we're really interested in trying to encourage connections between the public and the way that the built environment is produced and run. We have a sort of critical and immersive design process, from initiating our own projects to establishing new independent organizations, building ourselves and trying to open up the building process to others. Lots of our projects explore places and situations which we think have been undervalued, and we try to imbue them with a value by celebrating or reimagining them. This can manifest in lots of different ways, so we might take a cheap a cheap industrial material like roofing underlay and transform it into something theatrical, or sort of spatial reimagining, transforming a sort of interstitial motorway undercroft into a space of public activity, or a sort of programmatic re-envisaging, so creating a visible presence for forms of activity that often go unseen. Because we often work in contexts which are undervalued, we find that these are often the ones which are most vulnerable to transformation. This is very evident in London, where we're based. And whilst as a society, I think we tend to value our cultural heritage in the forms of grand public buildings, I think we tend to disregard the spaces, skills, and processes needed in order to create that culture. This network of back-of-house spaces contains the capacity and expertise that enables a versatile and dense world of activity to create a cultural life which we value so highly, and that is critical in making the city a space where we do things rather than a space where we only consume. Our work is highly visible, but I think the formative spaces and processes that influence them often remain very hidden. And we feel that it's important to kind of celebrate and make visible the complex environment that informs and enables our practice. So the Cineroleum was really sort of our foundational project. And it was our first workshop where we sort of learned the value of building as a collective activity, but also a testing ground for materials and ideas. This culture of improvisation and hands-on making is very important to us because it makes it possible to read and partake in the city differently, so that it's no longer so opaque or unquestionable, but instead malleable and full of possibility. This theme extends the design of many of our projects, which often celebrate and make visible the way that spaces, materials, and experiences are forged. So we established a space called Sugar House Studios, which is where we're based and is a sort of a form of multidisciplinary workshop where we work alongside product designers, carpenters, artists, textile designers, and musicians. You know, our space supports a place of professional designers, but beyond that, we were really interested in creating spaces that are able to open up that world of creative practice to a wider audience. So we established Bauhaus Workshop as an open access workshop in Walthamstow, which is in London, as an independent organisation which aimed to combine the spirit of building as a collective activity, an idea which was really formed in our sort of earlier projects, alongside the studio culture that was developing at Sugar House. So it was really conceived as a public library where the main resource is tools instead of books and is operated by technicians instead of librarians. The workshop offers woodworking and metalworking facilities in different modes. So there's bench space for professional makers, monthly memberships for amateur enthusiasts, and one-off courses for novices. It sort of attempts to make the most of its resources and to accommodate a broad range of people, creating an environment where the professional and the amateur can mix. During weekdays, it mostly sort of supports the practice of professionals, but after hours and at the weekend, it becomes a social and creative space for the wider community. It has a broad programme of sort of seminars, drop-in classes, and a monthly market, which sort of sells goods of people who are based there. And really, I think the sort of idea was that it's sort of founded on the premise of public access and the idea that, creating an institution where everyone is invited. So I think the sort of, for me, a sort of takeaway point from it is that, sharing resources can create a really enriching environment for everyone, both by creating, I think, quite a dynamic workspace for the people who are based there, for the professionals, but also a sort of practical and interesting resource for the public. That there's sort of a sense of the playful that permeates lots of our projects. And it can manifest in the sort of hands-on methodology of their creation, their experimental relationship to the city, and also the types of activity that the spaces try to support. The idea of the playful city has always been an area of investigation over the last few years. Baltic Street Adventure Playground is a new playground and organisation that we set up in collaboration with children, families, and playworkers. It was sort of initiated as an immediate and practical response to the challenges facing a group of children growing up in Dalmarnock, which is in East Glasgow. When we sort of first visited the area, we were sort of struck by the lack of provision for children to play. I mean, there isn't a single playground in the area, but also the fact that there's these sort of continual hoardings of construction sites because it's an area undergoing significant development. It struck us that this created a very disempowering context to grow up in, because after all, if a building site is sort of hoarded off for 5 years, that represents an entire childhood. So this project was really initiated with the sort of the aim of giving children in the area agency and freedom to shape the world around them. In this project, formal design really took a back seat, and we saw that our primary role was to create the social and physical infrastructure that would enable a playful environment. So we sort of began to envisage what that culture might look like by working alongside someone called Robert Kennedy, who is a youth worker from the area. In London, as in Berlin, the adventure play movement has a sort of very rich history that was really born out of that sort of the period of the post-war city. At that time, when there was very little formal play provision and a lot of sort of bomb sites and debris, children began to inhabit these sites using the bricks and timbers and other materials to create, build, and play. These evolved into a sort of series of loose associations of local institutions. And really they're sort of understood as environments where children could do it themselves against a backdrop of increasingly over-regulated environments. In this tradition of the adventure play movement, these are spaces that support child-led activity, that encourage experimentation and adventure and demonstrate the importance of taking risks. At Baltic Street, the key and many other sort of spaces like this, the key elements are sort of mud, water, materials, tools, and a campfire. You know, children have an amazing capacity to take what adults see as rubbish and to transform it through invention. In this way, aesthetic playgrounds should not be judged in aesthetic terms as sort of refined or finished set pieces, but rather valued as sites of experimentation which give children the possibility of creating their own realities. The theory of loose parts, written in 1971 by the architect Simon Nicholson, explores the idea that playing with loose parts expands opportunities for children and empowers them to develop their own realities. In London, you know, the current market pressures are placing our sort of art schools and studio spaces and workshops and factories, so the kind of the places of production, at real risk. You know, until recently I ran a postgraduate studio at the CAS, an art school in Whitechapel, fittingly described as the Allgate Bauhaus. It has, you know, a reputation as a brilliant art school, but within the last year, you know, its sort of central sites have been sold off, putting its specialist courses and the principle of a workshop-based education, often seen as space-hungry, at risk, with, you know, resultant consequences for teachers and students alike. I think the longer-term repercussions of this are sort of well understood by the artist Jeremy Deller when he said, "What China looks to Britain for is well-made and well-designed objects. The CAS might look like the past, but it is the future." I think the thread which connects these sort of two top themes is that in the context of childhood, environments that contain loose parts are, I think, quite easily understood to be more stimulating and engaging than static ones. It's a set of ideas that also informs our wider understanding about our relationship to the urban environment. To us, the fragile network of these types of spaces demonstrates really at quite a foundational level the importance of valuing the spaces, skills, and processes needed for creativity. For the past few years, we've been working in the Granby area of Liverpool. Here, over a significant period, residents have been actively working to take control of their neighbourhood against an environment where the council gradually rescinded their responsibilities and withdrew, leaving houses boarded up and the physical fabric of the area deteriorating. A small group of residents resisted the efforts to move them out and gradually started to retake control of their neighbourhoods, streets and frontages. In the void that had been created by so much demolition, they were able to exercise an enormous amount of freedom and control because no one in authority was really looking and no one really cared. They sort of took very immediate gestures and sort of extended domestic actions such as cleaning, planting and painting, taking the care and creativity with which they had made their homes and extending their sort of DIY actions out into the streets, digging up and planting the front yards and occupying and animating the public spaces. So this is an image from the monthly markets which they set up as a way of sort of bringing other people to the area and trying to see that the sort of a broader public could experience the area through a more positive lens. This group of residents sort of formalised to establish a community land trust with the intention of refurbishing many of the empty homes and maintaining them for community ownership. Their ambition was to gradually rebuild the area and the community, not through a sort of single uncompromising master plan, but a top-down vision, but an approach that allowed many different parties to have a stake. Our role was to make visible the Community Land Trust's ambition by setting out a strategy that would convince the local council to support them. This plan described an incremental, ground-up approach to rebuilding the area by developing a network of projects that could sort of think at a small scale. The first part of this project was to refurbish 10 of the derelict houses on Cairn Street. As part of this process, we established Granby Workshop to create a sort of, which was the sort of organisation that I referred to at the start of the talk, but this was sort of established to create a kind of neighbourhood-based architectural ceramics workshop, which could create elements for the homes that were being refurbished. So this is an example from the sort of right at the start when we were using one of the empty houses as the workshop. The products themselves are designed through sort of extensive material investigation, combining sort of craft techniques with an experimental sensibility to develop new architectural materials and finishes. So these are sawdust ceramics, so the sort of effect is created by sort of firing the ceramics in a barbecue alongside various additive chemicals, including banana skins. This is using an industrial ram press to create sort of ceramics which have sort of a sense of endless variation. And these are these mantelpieces which are used using some of the demolition rubble from the area in order to cast new mantelpieces which sit within the refurbished homes. We believe in the creative potential of manufacturing and try to use techniques that introduce sort of improvisation, chance, and randomness to the production line so that sort of no two products are alike. The workshop remains community-oriented, operating from Granby Street and participating in a monthly community market and continuing to contribute to ongoing renovations. So this is a sort of one of the projects which is on site at the moment, which is transforming 2 of the empty houses into a indoor winter garden and community space that can be sort of enjoyed by everyone. Granby's residents' sort of history of direct and creative action has been really the foundation to changes in the area, and Granby Workshop is part of a sequence of projects that aims to support this sort of DIY approach in which production and creativity are part of the everyday process of the city. In discussing these themes and projects, I hope I've sort of revealed some of the complex network of processes and spaces within the city that inform and enable our practice. And also to say that the value of alternate spaces of knowledge is that the tools they can equip us with to challenge the status quo and to conceive of new realities. After all, what starts in childhood play ends in society and culture and what we now call the creative economy. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Paloma. Now it's Jussi. Jussi Parker, I only met him today, but I'm a big fan. So, though it's not okay that to write trilogies, I must say. Trilogies, yeah, that's not, especially if they're getting better and better. No, they're all equally good, so I should not make any difference. I'm referring to the Media Ecology Trilogy, Digital Contagion, 2007, Insect Media, 2010, and Geology of Media, 2015. Some of you might also know the somehow by now classic 2012 book, What is Media Archaeology? With all these publications, I don't know why the University of Southampton made him a professor of technology, culture, and aesthetics at the Winchester School of Art. And unfortunately, this late book is not out yet, but the talk today will be related to these topics of labs, laboratories, and yeah, maybe also like the humanities. I'm really curious about your talk now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me as well. It's been wonderful. You know, when we are kids and we have imaginary friends, I think if I would nowadays have an imaginary friend, it would be an architect. It's lovely to hear architects talk about space. I would always want to have this imaginary architect next to me and kind of pointing out things that, look, you see, that building there, you need to look at this and this and this. So it's been a pleasure to hear actual architects and people who know and design spaces talk about spaces instead of like people like me who's trained as a historian. I'm like stumbling into a room and I kind of talk about things like histories of things like laboratories without probably knowing that much, but let's see where we end up. A lot of the things today have been giving us a really good coordinate system, I think, that is in a way starting to structure perhaps some key themes. This might be very obvious, but in a way now we have a coordinate system that is historical, from Bauhaus to Silicon Valley, obviously. Then we have this coordinate system that relates to these ways in which techniques and spaces are tied together, and this sort of relates also to story about universities nowadays as well, what kind of a space is hub, or what kind of techniques and technologies as well. For instance, 3D printing entering universities and that way changing university spaces. In a way, one of the coordinate systems has to do with formal and informal as well, and how these two things are entangled in design of spaces, and indeed universities and non-university spaces, and how increasingly there's a lot of functions that shift places according to this logic as well. The universities are doing a lot of things that universities are not supposed to be doing. And increasingly non-university spaces are taking the place, doing those things that used to be universities' privilege, or whether one likes it or not. The same applies to laboratories or labs. In a way, all of these terms that are really interesting, labs and workshops, offices, etc., there would be enough of interesting things to be said about how they are regularized and controlled, and how the history is about the regularization of those spaces as spaces where we perform knowledge, for instance. In a way, a lot of things I won't go into much, but there's an interesting story of how things like laboratories have entered humanities as well. Quite often we credit the digital humanities for this as a sort of a re-entry of the lab into humanities as part of the whole long history of humanities also being about infrastructures of knowledge. Quite often it's claimed that humanities is never really thought about their own space in which they do things, but actually there's a long history since medieval universities, and Friedrich Hitler knew this already, that is exactly about thinking about what kind of space are we teaching in the spirit, so to speak. But I'll start with something that is suitably light, perhaps suitably following up on the earlier tea point. Perhaps at this point we need something stronger than tea. I'll start with something that I would at least seem suitable to start this discussion about contemporary iterations of the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus Brew Lab in Minneapolis, US. With its range of products, it seems a hipster way of attaching to the legacy of the Bauhaus that is both suitably smart, wink wink, but also includes a fair bit of reference to the actual Bauhaus too. As the Brew Lab introduces itself, the brewery is dedicated to German-style beer. It's weird to kind of talking about this in Berlin. It's like bringing coal to Newcastle, talking about beer in Berlin. German-style beer with, I quote, a sense of play and adventure. Itself sort of an interdisciplinary enterprise, the Bauhaus Brew Lab's family, as they call themselves, of musicians, scientists, artists, and above all, in their words, beer lovers, that in fitting ways is not indeed an accidental reference to what we are here on about, the Bauhaus. As the Beer Lover Lab creatives explain it, and this is a very usual story, but still I'm going to go through that, in their words, brief existence in post-World War I Germany, Bauhaus school, blah, 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 crucible of modernism, the impact of Bauhaus can be still felt today, the Bauhaus was inspiring not just because of the extraordinary group of brilliant, visionary people involved, but because it was fueled by a commitment to creativity and experimentation with the underlying tenet that work, play, and celebration should be intertwined. Who could say no? Here at Bauhaus Brew Labs, we live by Bauhaus' concept that the joy of art and craft should be celebrated as part of everyday life. Wow. Oddly enough, it is somewhat reminiscent of what Johannes Itten in 1919 already prescribed as the version of what nowadays would be part of effective capitalism or cognitive capitalism, no? In his Bauhaus words, play becomes celebration, celebration becomes labor, labor becomes play. In a triangle feedback loop of the idealized community of creativity. Again, quite fitting to a lot of the topics we talked about already today, related to mobilization of fun. Now, I could not, at this point at least, find a more fitting example of tying two strands of today's interest and debates. So Bauhaus is constantly iterated, narrativized, discursive model of an activity style, but perhaps also an effective ethos, or perhaps what Lorraine Daston would have called moral economy, that over the years of 20th century travels across fields of design to wider cultural influence and a backbone of variety of debates and institutional models, including in art and technology, and also the current enthusiasm for labs, laboratories, what I opt to call in this case lab fever. Perhaps a slight homage to Jacques Derrida's more analytical and more Freudian archive fever, but in this case accompanied by the suitably Germanic beer fumes of the creative brew lab. Indeed, it implies that we can take the Bau and the Haus pretty seriously, as a focus to the ways in which particular activities are linked to infrastructural thinking and projects, and to particular spaces of knowledge in rather literal ways too. And perhaps in this way, this is also responding to the past decades of STS literature, so social studies of science and technology, on terms like boundary objects, trading zones, and indeed the moral economies and imaginaries of those spaces of knowledge. As we heard, space is pretty complex. Lab fever is the feverish spread of the term, of the short label of the lab through a range of institutional, discursive and practical uses that tells both of the transformation of contemporary universities. It does impact and transform universities, especially inside the nexus of art, humanities and technology, and also then the suitably positive, open-ended connotations that this shorted word for laboratory gets as part of marketing, from coffee labs to beer labs to fashion labs in department stores. There's so many labs. In many ways, the lab's overly elusive as the lab is overly elusive that it claims to pertain to a whole landscape of contemporary culture across multiple geographical locations. Yet it is still used also by colleagues that are rather critical, in a good way, critical and self-reflective in institutional situations too. So it would be easy to claim that this is just another kind of a sign of neoliberalism, but it would be also in the risk of too easily being dismissive and throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. It's not only about the metaphorical usage of the shortly, easily adaptable term. You just need to actually talk to people in labs. You just need to talk to people and ask people who are running actual labs, from media archaeology labs to critical media labs to design labs and many, many others. And actually the term starts to expand to discussions about hands-on epistemologies, about infrastructural assessment of intellectual activities, of continuums of practice and theory, etc. Terms and metaphors are constantly poached. Concepts travel. But when it comes to the lab, the iterative sense of the connection to Bauhaus has been one persistent feature, at least in the art and technology context. So my colleague Ryan Bishop and together with John Beck are writing a book that is really parallel to what Fred Turner has been doing for a long time. They are writing a book on Cold War art and technology initiatives, and their recent reboots at institutions like MIT and LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the Art and Technology Initiative that ran in the early 1970s and rebooted now with the bit of help, sponsorship from Google, etc., etc. And they point to this iterative sense of attachment that becomes both a historical note and it becomes a brand line. So recognizing the significance of the mid to late 1960s key events and sites of US art and tech, again, that's something that we already heard today, from MIT's CAVs to LACMA to experiments in art and technology, they unfold the back and forth narrative that is part and parcel of how avant-garde is performed and written into the story as well, of contemporary corporate labs as well. So in their words, Beck and Bishop, from Dada, Futurism, and Surrealism and Constructivism funneled through the Bauhaus, Black Mountain College and Fluxus via the art and technology, to the ways in which recent examples, for example at MIT, refer back to this legacy, including, indeed, the Bauhaus. So the coordinate system seems to be very much resonating indeed with what Fred Turner was talking about and the historical notes, and also how the sort of entry of the corporate lab as part of the infrastructure of the art and technology labs is part of the story of how we should look at corporations, well, Facebooks as well, as versions of certain kind of ethos that then penetrates these spaces, but the other way around as well, how increasing amount of infrastructure of art and technology and humanities as well is offered through these corporations as well. So there's the kind of entanglement of narratives and infrastructures is important here. So in a way, the current horizon of the experiment, the interdisciplinary, the infrastructure of making, they have multiple legacies, but they also hark back to the key events of 20th century in terms of historical self-contextualization. What Avital Ronell called the more widespread test drive of modern culture of testing, experimenting, and projecting, it becomes institutionalized as the lab drive. Particular institutions that start to build this as their infrastructural, again, material and discursive justification. So in this sense, referring to John Roberts, one can observe that the artistic avant-garde's repertoire of methods becomes something that seems to characterize the wider lab fever and the lab drive. So consider something that is a list of artistic practices in the contexts of technological culture and post-conceptual art, but consider his description of what art practices are also as a description of lab fever. So what he calls art applies to at least a self-description of labs as well. In his words, art, but also labs, is now represented by an unprecedented range of material, immaterial, and temporal activities, ideational forms, critical networks, projective models, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary thought experiments, performative manifestations, theoretical templates, virtual systems, social participatory events, and environmental interventions. So as sometimes a sort of a silent feed forward of the avant-garde lab, the lab is voiced in multiple ways. Perhaps it can refer to some actual themes that start to respond to the question as to what is the lab good for? Or instead of the usual assumption that one finds in most or a lot of texts written about the lab, that the lab itself would be an answer. It would be an answer to interdisciplinarity, it would be an answer to experiment. Perhaps it is the symptom and the issue itself that needs to be explicated. Perhaps it is indeed a symptom. Why a lab? The infrastructural angle to the lab is often discussed in digital humanities, and this is again my more university-focused angle, as a claim that finally humanity starts to recognize the university as an infrastructural space. And of course in Berlin, we know that Friedrich Kittler was already on about this for a long time ago. Space itself was already for a longer period part of the formation of procedures and the grey infrastructure of knowledge. But it has recently risen again to the focus, probably because often in humanities one is handed down spaces for use. Rarely is one asked to design a bespoke space with a budget attached to it. I'm part of the humanities generation who was just happy to have an office of any sort, just wander into a lecture room, speak for a while, nip out. But nowadays, we actually get the chance of handing down budget lines sometimes, and we can design spaces almost from scratch. But again, this whole question about space, infrastructure, and knowledge can be also understood or perhaps contextualized with a bit of help from Keller Easterling. Well, Keller Easterling helps with a lot of things if we want to think through really complex things, but again here. So, okay, this comes, of course, from a slightly different geopolitical context and scale, but still relevant. So, larger geopolitical context, Easterling points to the changed role of the designer, okay? From making things, obviously, to approaching design at a different scale of organizing matter, organizing people, and emerging relationships in ways that set up, in her words, relative potentials within them. So perhaps it indeed is in this sense that the design project of the lab is the lab. The mistaken, perhaps what Whitehead would call misplaced concreteness, that the lab produces things, products, prototypes and whatnot, of course, part and parcel of how we perform a lab, like we're here performing a workshop on stage, duh. Perhaps the lab itself was the only thing that it was supposed to prototype, right? The sorts of techniques from prototyping to modeling, experiments to participatory events, but also the gray side of things relating to external income generation become what forms the lab itself as the lab product. Hence, the lab, of course, and this is a very truism to say even aloud, but the lab is a project. So what could be called the infrastructural strata is not merely things and machines, bolts and wires, but relates to the emerging time spans that define the lab. One experiences the lab like we experience other spaces of knowledge, as the particular rhythms and schedules that defines its work patterns, like we used to do with offices that radically changed over time, but also the time span of the project itself in which one is employed. The precarity of the lab is both experiential and also part of the political economy in which labs are nested. The project-to-project funding structures that are the time span of the experiment as it pertains to current work cultures and creative cultures, including academia, play, celebration, labor. And again, of course, these are themes expressed earlier by the likes of Gerald Ronig, Bojana Kunst, and many others. The project has emerged as a key term that temporally structures and effectively regulates creative work. But in a similar sense, there is a rather apt sense of the project as the infrastructural scale of effective and temporal coordinates of how you design a space that seems so heterogeneous as a lab. The lab itself is itself a suitable project as it becomes a potential, a most likely short-term intensive fix built around ideas of openness, work in progress, prototyping, and in many cases on short-term or part-time contracts, as well as external funding apparatuses that define the lab itself on a project-to-project basis. This is where our project that is up there now as well, What is a Media Lab, kicks in, a collective project with Darren Welshler and Laurie Emerson, where we try to make sense of the changing ecology, perhaps, is slightly overused word sometimes, but ecology in the sense of media labs and humanities labs, in terms of the various political economies, the various techniques that are formative of the lab, but also how it feeds into sort of a political anthropology or kind of a related experience of what is the lab in relation to indeed themes that were mentioned, for instance, labor, paid labor and unpaid labor. So it starts to build a complex, the lab is a term, starts to build this complex denominator for a variety of these practical and theoretical and other discursive themes that might refer back to legacies of the 1920s and 30s, but also reactivate in different political and technological contexts that indeed demand to ask, in which way is the lab a symptom? I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Yeah. As I said before, I briefly introduced the respondents. I start with Philipp Oswalt, an architect professor of architecture theory and design at the University of Kassel, who worked also as an editor for Arc Plus and at OMA in Rotterdam. From 2009 to 2014, he was director of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, and being part of the organization team, I must say I learned well, I could nearly say more than I knew before, just by the preparation meetings from him. Also part of the organization team is Joanne Poussanc. She's an architect, curator, plenty of activities. I'll be really brief. And she teaches at École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture à Toulouse. Who wouldn't like to work there? Only very briefly, Brave New Alps, because you're going to do the third part, the evening part. Bianca Elsenbaumer and Fabio Franz. Their design practice focuses on politics of social and environmental issues, community economies, and do-it-yourself making. Finally, Joachim Krause. He has been a professor of design theory at the Hochschule Anhalt in Dessau since 1999, and apart from all his exhibitions, worked as an editor also for Arc Plus and TV documentaries. Contributor. At least, not everything, but TV documentaries, that's correct.
Yes.
He published several well-known studies, notably also on Buckminster. I read a little sketch that he sent in the preparation, no? Did you?
Yes.
Yeah, and that was worth a keynote. So I know that you're all like super prepared. There are several ways of, I have a lot of questions, but I thought maybe as a first round it would be best to start with the respondents, but not only the respondents, also the speakers, to ask each other questions, and then we see, like, as a second round if there are other statements. Yeah. So now I lean back, and maybe Philipp, you wanna start, because we had a chat before.
I can give it a try. I think what is kind of very obvious that kind of what we see as a space is not the space itself. And so there is, as you, I mean, it's also already this confusion between the counterculture in California and what is Facebook. So it looks so similar, and we can take your Black Horse workshop in London, and this could be Facebook headquarters. It's hard to distinguish. And I think, but this is not, yeah, it's hard to distinguish. I mean, visually it's hard to distinguish, but it's not the complete story. And I think that is very important, that we don't think that the space we see is the, that we will understand the space. And I think I would like really very the sharp talk by Rainier. And obviously this shift you described, kind of that we can't have so much in this kind of leisure rhetoric and fun rhetoric today, is of course a shift in the idea of efficiency. So in the 1950s, efficiency was still based on the Fordist model. So to be systematic, to be rational, that was the ideology of efficiency. If it was true or not, it doesn't matter, but this was an ideology, and this was produced in architecture. Today we have a different idea of efficiency. We have so the idea is creativity is efficiency, and the creative process needs kind of a casual setting, a fun setting. And so still kind of the aim is for efficiency, but the mode is very, very different. And it is interesting, I think that you did a brilliant design with the Springer office, but I have a very ambivalent feeling about the project. And so it is also there are other ways of efficiency. So if you study the building, there is, on the one hand, this kind of efficiency of the creative process, kind of the mise en scene, the staging of informality. I think there is a good deal of community building, of identification. So you kind of, in a smart turn, the need for daylight, you turned, I mean, you showed this dull office from Rotterdam or Amsterdam, with this kind of big atriums, which were, sorry? The Hague, but this was like, was dull because these atriums did not more than provide daylight, and so you kind of inverted the atrium inside the building, and so you have not only daylight, but you have kind of a central space which kind of creates this kind of community idea for the company. And of course, I think that it's very much also with Facebook and Apple and all of these new headquarters, it's very much about the community building. But at the same time, it is, of course, a super dense building. So they get a kind of much more floor area ratio than you would normally allow in Berlin. You have the workplaces are much smaller than they used to be, so it's compressed. I mean, the idea of the informality is not only to stimulate the creative cognitive processes, but it's also kind of a neoliberal model of compression. So, hot desking is, I mean, they just, they save more than half of the workplace they used to spend. So I assume that the workers in the old-fashioned Springer building have double the space than in your new building. And so I think there's very interesting that there's different modes of efficiency applied in this building, which are very symptomatic for our times, which I think it's a very good way to come to an architecture of the agenda of the client, but it does not necessarily mean that I love the building. Yeah? So I think it's, in this sense, very successful. And so the last point, not to be too long, I think that, I mean, of course, I think in the end, if this kind of the question of the space, we have to speak about agency or the agenda of what is happening. And of course, the agenda of Springer is something very different from the agenda you, for example, at Assemble, try to do with Black Horse Workshop, or what you try in your case, Brave New Arts. And so I think that is an important, the institutional setting is an important dimension to the space. And I'm wondering, I don't know about it. I mean, it's quite interesting how a company like Springer or Facebook manage kind of on the micro scale to give this motivation of fun and leisure and experimentation to the employees, but still have then streamlined to the business agenda of the company. And I think that is kind of the interesting point, how you manage kind of to have this individual, the feeling of individual experimentation, but nevertheless be streamlined to the agenda of the company.
The initial plan was to have like more respondents, but I feel that you're eager to respond, or we can gather more momentum of criticism. No, because I hear different like sounds. You wanna?
Was I making sounds?
No. I hear several kind of and kind of sounds. So
I'll jump in and simply be excited. I mean, I thought it was fascinating, and I think you're absolutely right. What intrigued me was seeing the same interaction styles, the same emphasis on collaborativeness, on playfulness, on the development of individuality. The play space you described was fascinating, where they all built things together. I could take you to rooms in Facebook where they would do that with coffee, you know, and that's, I think that's fascinating. A couple of questions came to my mind, some about class, some about the distinction between play and sport, for example, and about who plays in regimented ways and who doesn't. But the one that really I wanted to ask some of the designers who've been working is, how do you articulate a logic of laboratory, of playfulness, of project, which is temporary and self-centered, identity-centered, to a logic of institutions? So you might free kids for an hour, but how do you free them for a lifetime? How do you attach these modes of play and these structures of play to institutions that can help keep things open for a long time? That was just the question that I had. And they killed the buzz for the room. Yeah.
It's a design brief for our designers. Go. You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah. How are we going to do this?
Yeah, I was just going to
do we start with the first question?
Yeah, maybe it's best because it's on the plate.
Yeah, okay.
Because Renier has 3 responses.
Spaces aren't what they look. I mean, as an architect, of course, I agree with that. But that doesn't mean that spaces betray and are very good symptoms, telltale signs of an underlying mentality as to why the spaces are wanted. For me, the difference between Facebook and the SOM office isn't so much the the Fordism and the post-Fordism. It's got very little to do with the fact that efficiency has anything to do with regimentation or informality. I think the informality is a guise. I think what spaces at Google and Facebook do is that they simply look informal so they can more efficiently consume people's private time to also count as work time. When you don't have a formal, when you don't have a formal side, you're fully informal, you are sort of compelled to feel that spare time isn't legitimate unless it is invested in the creativity for the company. And I think there the notion of a formal side and even a suit and a tie or a white coat, actually you can take off that white coat and you can be yourself, and nobody's got anything to do with that. And in that space you're free. Once the informal is incorporated in the production process, it's a remnant of freedom that goes. So for me, the irony of the spaces is that, in a way, what they imply is a sort of, through a kind of hippie fascism, is in a way they eat up people. They kill the independence of people. Then, so that was. Then you said you didn't like the Springer building, which, which of course. As an architect, I'm utterly resilient to people not liking the buildings we do, and I'm even resilient to people not liking buildings altogether. And let me start by saying that all of what you say is true. It's at least partially true. And as an architect, and particularly our office, and you clearly know our office, well, almost as well as I do. No. We engage with the very things we ourselves are very ambiguous about. That is a choice. We could engage in smaller buildings, we could engage in safer commissions. I mean, all of this begins like, why as an organization would you want to work with Springer? I mean, there is a lot to be taken from that. We invariably do. We also work for the China Central Television, build an even bigger building. There's probably much more to be said about that, but we have always, in a way, chosen to get our hands dirty and to deliberately get our hands dirty to choose for the organizations that embody the trends we see. And since the trends are ambiguous, we engage because we assume that, yes, that in all these trends we can somehow make a difference. We can somehow use the forces of the waves to go against the waves at times. So that is why we deal with Springer. I think Springer is a different thing from Facebook and Google. I have to say, I have to stress that. And I don't think that is just Springer that is better than Google. I think that is a difference, a fundamental difference between ultimately European and American culture, where America simply, the culture embodies a more unconditional surrender to the latest thing that generates profits, etc. And I think Europe is by definition ambiguous. That's often very irritating about Europe because they fail to take really modern concepts to the same extreme conclusion. I think in the case of a building like this, the building partly indeed accommodates with the spatial program given, where probably the average space for employees is smaller than the existing buildings, but there is a bigger space in the building, there is a more collective space in the building. What it tries to do is, in exchange, give a number of things back in relation to that in itself very hard to combat trend, because if you disagree with that trend, you reject the commission. Almost, but I don't want to be on the defense. And then the last thing you asked, I can't remember.
It was
but I think
it's agency, but
I think it's answered.
The other respondents, you want to enter the discussion?
Actually, maybe maybe it's a question or a comment. I don't know what it is, but it's like we are talking a lot about this formal, informal, and we go back and forth. And somehow I have the feeling that informal is just because we are not able to say something else so far, or it's unplanned or undesigned, and it's a space where the architect has actually nothing to do but making a free space, or something that is able to be used and reinterpreted by people. I mean, when Claudia Marais was saying that here, I think it was Claudia today who was saying that here it was in fact willing to be really informal, but in fact the techniques and everything makes it in the end very formal.
Yeah.
As well, when we see the setup in Springer now, I mean, I'm sure there is. Yeah, it's not the most informal. So this is the mix already.
The camera.
The camera is everywhere.
No, I see the camera.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's in my back, apparently. So, but there is a thought behind the informal spaces. It's not informal. The thing is that they are able to evolve much faster. Or? I mean, it's not just about the Axel Springer campus. It's also about all other practices or assembled practices. I have the feeling that we are going far from this form follows function, and that we are entering something where there is no professional, there is no amateur, there is much more flexibility, and the terms for defining it are missing.
Before you all answer, I think that's a key and a systematic point, because we do not have just this double of material, immaterial, formal, informal, but the way this discussion started was with print and digital media, right? So we have the three doubles, and the move that you somehow described, and I'm not the architecture critic here, but I thought the switch was interesting between digital and becomes the formal and the other way around. So let's keep the three doubles in mind. But you wanted to say something?
Yeah, well, I was going to sort of, I guess, touch on the discussion of the sort of plan for this building, because I think it also touches on some of the points earlier, which is, and this idea of formality and informality. And, you know, I'm no historian, but I see that there's quite a sort of direct path between, you know, the history of, you know, the picturesque landscape and you know, sort of offices like, and my German is Büro Landschaft, and the planning of the work environment as if it's a natural environment. And I suppose the sort of the conceit of the picturesque landscape is always that sort of it's hiding the real mechanics. So, you know, so you present the informal landscape, and below it a sort of a hidden the real workings. And I suppose that's I think some of the sort of maybe sort of fear that's being raised when there's this thing about the formality and the informality, and is the informality actually perhaps you know, a veil for something that is more malevolent about you know, society's workings, or is this really not this as a particular project, but as a culture? You know, this is the privileged space of work, right? If you get to work in the Menlo Parks or buildings like this, you're a fortunate worker. Whereas I suppose the flip side of that is some of the images that we saw earlier from the previous presentation of sort of the places and the situations and the people who get displaced, often for the sort of large new construction projects and campuses.
It's you too.
Yes. I mean, while hearing you talk about spaces of knowledge as spaces of work, play, and celebration, what really kind of I'm missing in terms of to reference also to our work is is there space for exhaustion, for non-flexibility, for people who are not incredibly independent and flexible, but who have commitments of care. And I'm wondering if maybe that could be the difference between a Facebook office, where I suppose there is space for celebration and play for people who are flexible, autonomous, able-bodied, and so on. And maybe in more independent studios like Assemble, maybe there is also space for exhaustion and doubt and a different kind of subjectivity to come out.
You want to Joachim? Because
yeah, I think that the career of those spaces for creative work, you know, is due to the changing of economic value. It's we have this expression of creative economy, you know, since 10 years or so, and it's quite clear that in a transformation of labor, the routine the work is disappearing more and more, and the creative part of labor is, or the innovative part of labor. That's what counts. And therefore, those spaces, you know, we had before only in the milieu of artists, like the atelier, you know, it's not only the lab, but spaces which are not, where you can live and work, for instance, you know, or combine living and working, are becoming more and more interesting, and or necessary, even necessary, for being successfully in an economic sense. Yeah. So, and this is also what happens with methodologies like design thinking also. Yeah, design thinking. Why do those companies need design thinking? Why? They have problems. They have really problems, and they get more and more problems, and therefore it is absolutely interesting for them to adapt methods, techniques, spaces, ways of living, and to try to integrate this in their economic scheme. So, and I think to come back to the Bauhaus, you know, the Bauhaus is interesting insofar as it was a model not only for education, learning, and doing design, arts, and so on, but it always had this dimension of a collectivity and living together, celebration, celebrating, things like that. So, and this, I mean, is temporarily interesting for companies, but only temporarily restricted, and yes, and it's not the same. So I would say we always have that problem, that the historical difference is made by losing the innocence. I mean, the Bauhaus in Weimar, this was in a state of innocence. They had not the economic ambition. In Dessau, it changed. And I think in 1928, exactly in 1928, when Gropius and Molineux, Herbert Bayer, and so on, left the Bauhaus, you know, to be professional, to do their professional work, then Herbert Bayer is a very good example. Then we have all these dimensions of combining the commercial conception and the creative, creative potential. So, and this is really something that is interesting for us today, and also with that combination of the different activities, you know, because it's not only knowledge production, it's more. It is also, it is knowing. It is knowing, you know, and this is not the same than knowledge production. Knowledge production of the universities is a different model.
I think we're at the center a bit of our discussion, because space and knowledge basically are, one could say naively, one is material, space, and knowledge is something immaterial. But you gave it a kind of historical explanation. There's an economic change, there's maybe also technological change. One could say from the more material to the immaterial, but I doubt so. So, and I'm sure Jussi has something to say about the even geological impact of our so-called cloud or immaterial economy. But maybe the order of like comments is now you, then Fred, and Jussi.
Yeah, so back to the beginning of this round, we spoke about a number of twin phenomena, about a number of dualities: formal, informal, design, non-designed, print, digital, if I sum it up correctly. But that is not to say that formal equals designed and informal equals non-designed. So, and that's also not, certainly not what I tried to say. I tried to say the opposite. I tried to say that the informal is incredibly staged, incredibly designed, because there is a huge ulterior motive behind the informal. By the way, the SOM people in the first image, in as much as I only implied it, I will make it explicit, I consider those people extremely fortunate. I consider them extremely fortunate because they had a formal life, and that meant they had an informal life as a flip side. You can never have an informal life if you can't also have a formal life. And in that sense, you talk about routine work. In the context of my daily work, I can assure you that I welcome routine work almost as a form of liberalization.
Yes.
As a form, but I'm sure many people in the images, and an increasingly large part of working sectors which are now being branded creative, actually have an almost nostalgic longing for, when I do routine work, I know what to do. And it's the only moment in the day that I do not feel profoundly guilty about my seeming permanent lack of creativity. And in that sense, that's why I think the Christian ethos is such, and the boy's own is such a fantastic analogy, that you build up a debt, you build up a moral debt by working. I mean, it's one of the wonderful paradoxes of our time. And working from home for me is something similar. I mean, when you work from home, you have never off. You know, and the emptiness of, I mean, the emptiness in G-Star was because we took pictures before the building was occupied. The emptiness in the second building I show, incidentally, is actually caused by what in Dutch is called het nieuwe werken. That's a law, a policy. That's neue werken, where people can work from home. So that means also, by the way, that since half of the people is presumed to work from home, the workspace in an office is half. I mean, it's part of the same trend, but it doesn't mean you have to work half as much. Your productivity is just exported increasingly into your private sphere. And that's why the guys in image number one, I would sort of almost feel strangely nostalgic for the clarity of their world.
But the model for that is the work of the artist.
Well,
yeah. So I want to pull together a couple of the comments that I heard, particularly the last three. And I want to take a historical perspective. I think one of the things that we see when we look in these spaces historically is a fusion of two very large-scale, 100-year-plus transformations. One is economic, the rise of new industrial forms, the rise of new kinds of products, the rise of new kinds of goods, and the revaluing of some kinds of goods. You know, my shoes now are much less valuable as shoes, material goods, than they are as branded artifacts on my feet that give me an identity in the world. That's a powerful transformation. The other transformation that I think is really important is the rise of a kind of secular individualism, particularly in the West, connected to counterculture, connected to precisely the revolt against industrial man that we see at the beginning of the 20th century, or we see much earlier in Romanticism. But that revolt has given us a language of cool, of hip, of authenticity, of individuality that we counterpose to the routine, but that has since become the style of a new elite. You know, Facebook is very much an upper class operation. And so I think it's really important to tune into those large shifts. The last shift I would just throw in the mix is the history of psychology. You know, I see a lot of Abraham Maslow floating through our lives together here. You know, I see a lot of, you know, well, the highest goal is to be self-fulfilled. When Lori Gohler, the head of HR at Facebook, or when Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook says, you need to bring your whole person to work and our factory will be a place for your self-development, they're speaking Maslow. But they're speaking Maslow through an imagery from the counterculture, which owes its debt to the artistic critique of industry. It's a very peculiar combination, and this is why I asked you, Paloma, about the connection to institutions. I want to be free. I want to be wholly myself. I find, like Rainier, that I am most wholly myself when I can have some part of myself that doesn't have to come out into the public. You know, I think John Cage was free in his private life a lot of times because he wore a suit sometimes in public, and I think about that a lot. So I wonder how we can free folks to be more themselves when they want to be, but give them a kind of consistent, class-crossing way of being able to be private. Last thought, and it's a word that we haven't really touched on much, but I want to hit it pretty hard, and the word is class. In a world of routine informality and collaboration, the force that organizes the group ceases to be rules, ceases to be bureaucracy, ceases to be ways to distribute resources, and becomes culture and cool. And if you don't share the dominant culture in that space, if you are uncool, you can't play. And I would argue, and have argued in print and other places, that sets the stage for I think what Rainier was calling hippie fascism, and that I would call a new kind of authoritarianism, one that we see in America a lot today, even in Menlo Park.
I'll just pick up on that directly. It's really interesting because the question of class works on so many scales as well. It works on scales that are crucially important. That is the traditional way we understand class as well, but also the ways in which, for instance, university teaching and structures is being reorganized as well, according to this sort of a scale of, well, the ones who want to do something new, for instance, have a lab, and the ones who are really resistant to change. And this sort of a trope of resistance to change is the kind of the uncoolness in relation to this kind of class structures, which are really like also discursive ways of regulating how people should be behaving in relation to whether there's institutional work as an academic or institutional work as an artist or something else in other works as well. And that's sort of a like, again, mobilization of moral economies. Becomes actual material de facto ways in which it feeds as part of the financial and architectural arrangements of institutions like universities, for instance. Paloma mentioned art schools as well earlier as well, and it's really interesting to look at art schools exactly as this sort of a test bed for that question of what are exactly the mechanisms of where knowing and activities turn into knowledge and units that are financializable, financial units as well. And that's sort of like financial language is the language where questions such as formal and informal turn into the sort of like regulatory mechanisms, right? The things that we kind of like on an effective level have to feel suitably, motivatingly informal for anyone to be in academia, anyone to be an artist, for instance, as well, is also the way in which it's just a matter of another scale to be formalizable into a unit that can be costed in some ways. And the costings are also interesting of how it works in spaces. So there would be great things for somebody to write about basically universities only through the costing mechanisms of space. And that would be a great book for somebody to write. Perhaps it's out there, but I haven't heard about it. But basically the sort of really great mechanisms of how costings work and how that's a regulatory mechanism, at least in Britain. And that really strikes at the core of transformation of art schools in Britain as well. University internal costings mechanisms as the true nature of what space is about in art schools and other actually disciplines.
I get something in mind if you speak about the class system. When I was reading Moholi's Vision in Motion, I was shocked by this idea of elitism. In the very end of the book, he provides an imagination to have kind of a think tank of artists and engineers and scientists who show the way to the world to go. So also completely unpoliticized, as depoliticized. And the idea, so we are the elite, and we defined the destiny of society. So it was not a class model, but it was a very elitist and in the end authoritarian model. So there is, I think it's something different than what we have faced today, but there are certain similarities in the thinking. I would like also to come to another aspect of Rainier's talk in the question of the formal to the non-design. It's quite interesting. I mean, the formal is, of course, very much the informal is very much a staging. And so, if you look into the Silicon Valley companies, I mean, this myth about the garage as a creative place. I mean, it's so funny how they stage themselves that they have been all invented in garages. And if you really look into the history of these companies, the story is very, very different, and there was not much about the garage. So, for example, Apple was much more about Stanford and Hewlett-Packard and so on. So it was, in a sense, kind of a non-design condition, actually kind of not so removed from universities. So, I mean, as also with Facebook, as we know, I mean, so universities played a role. And also kind of other companies played a role. So it was also very much kind of in the context of certain institutional settings. And so there is, I mean, that's very obvious. And there is, I just want to enforce what you said, I mean, there is very much the idea with this informality is this kind of social engineering. And I would oppose your idea that this is not a functionalist idea. I think it's very much based on a psychological idea of functionalism. Yeah, so kind of there is a behavioral concept which is then kind of the basis for a new kind of functionalism.
I agree.
Okay,
I agree.
sorry, then I misunderstood.
No, it's just more complex than just one function, one space.
But it's interesting then to look at the OMA office as office, which is kind of, in a sense, a non-design, Rainier. I mean, there is no rhetoric. It's kind of a generic office, as you said. And so, I mean, it's a very creative place which doesn't use this rhetoric and which operates in a different way. And there is maybe something which kind of, to go to another point, which was stressed in the abstract, the word kind of the relevance of physical production in the design process. So this is another question, I mean, going away from the question of planned and non-planned and formal, informal. Of course, the physical production, I mean, in the Bauhaus, the workshop was very important. And this, I think, something OMA and Ensemble shares, the kind of the meaning of physical production to allow other modes of knowledge processes.
Yeah, I struggle always with the term knowledge production, because I always thought that knowledge was something you acquired, which is different. In terms of our office, and I relate back to the notion of class, I think our office is in Rotterdam on purpose, because at the time we located there, Rotterdam was very inconspicuous, not very designed, it was a shithole, essentially. Our building is at an inconspicuous part of town. The building is, it's a mascot, but I only knew that years later after working there. It's apparently architecture. But you only see that when it's photographed in black and white too. That, I think, is, and that is part of a very important mechanism. It's strangely, I only become aware of the status of our office when you introduce me, or when I go to the Venice Biennale. That it's some rare moments with the outside that I actually become aware of some role, of something people attribute to you, and I know this office from within, and the realities are quite hard to match for me, but I think, and I've also thought that later that is very, very much on purpose, that the generic, inconspicuous nature of the choice of that space is also designed to make any awareness of status go away when you're working. Because, I mean, the moment you design, and any creative labor, and I think of anybody who's involved will share this, the moment you think about its reception, that is the precise moment that the creativity is gone. So I think that's it. And it's, yeah, also our office, it's a little bit designed. It's partially designed, but we default by design, it is.
Yeah, I mean, I've got 2 points, which I get. One is picking up. One is, I think, on this thing of class, which also I think Fred is picking up on a point that you mentioned earlier, and I haven't got a conclusion, but I think it sort of raises an interesting, an interesting question for me in relation to it, which is that you mentioned that at Facebook, amongst the sort of whilst amongst, say, the cleaning staff, there might be unions, there aren't amongst the sort of the people who sort of, the designers, if you like, or the coders. And actually, you know, it's very similar in the world of architecture, right? There are no significant architecture unions. And so I feel that there probably is a point there about, again, perceptions of class and about perceptions that largely, you know, middle-class professions have sort of are less organised in terms of unionisation. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. The second was kind of trying to connect to this earlier thing about. I think it's interesting. There's 2 ways that we're sort of talking about contemporary office space. One is of the lab, the image of the sort of science space, the space of innovation. But the other is the sort of informal space, is almost the domestication of workspaces. So, you know, that they are now spaces where you will have your Persian rug and you will have your breakout space and you will have the sort of accoutrements of your home life around you, and sort of aligned to that has been touched upon, the work is increasingly in the home as well. So you know, the sort of elision of these 2 conditions, and it sort of strikes me, based on what you were talking about earlier about the suit and taking off, is that we've sort of very quickly come to this quite a nostalgic moment where we're saying, you know, where is that time when I could sort of shut off when I got home at 6 p.m. and, you know, not have you know, emails and people trying to contact me, and the feeling that work was a perpetual state, but actually there were clear divisions between the 2. Although, you know, evidently that is a form of nostalgia, because if you sort of look at previous eras of, you know, of model factories and the idea that the company would build the home for the factory workers and that would have a sort of form of total control. This is evidently a sort of a historic tussle between the states of what it is to be sort of a private and what it is and have a private domestic life, and also to sort of work, to have an external workplace.
We have like 15-20 minutes left if we want to. If there's no, if there are any more comments on
Can I just briefly pick up on that?
Yeah.
I think because it's
and then
really,
we open the floor for a few questions.
It's going to be really brief. In terms of like, this would also bring gender into play as well in terms of various histories of the ways in which work has been inscribed in public space and in domestic space, and how that sort of plays into this sort of a like question of what is work nowadays as well in relation to histories of gender and work and unpaid labor as well, right? So that would be interesting. There's something really interesting. I'm going to point. Can I get that under here? Because it's hiding here. This image. If you can see it or not, I don't know. But if you can see, there's supposed to be cameras everywhere. That's what they told me.
It's coming.
360. Uh-oh. Yeah, I'm going to feel like really okay now. Good. Anyway, so basically, the really interesting thing is that historians of science know this already, and they told us already as well. But sort of like a lot of, you know, we're quite late in some other fields as well. Is the ways in which at the same time, laboratories in science, of course, radically changed from the usual ways in which we thought about imageries of laboratories, and nowadays in relation to various ways that they are distributed architectures more so, and computerized architectures, infrastructures, whereas there's a lot of investment in humanities arts to the situated place that we call then a lab, and it's completely distanced from the actual ways in which labs developed. And that image is really interesting. That's besides the fact that it's the kind of main leading image to our website for the What is a Media Lab project. My colleague with that, Darren Welshler, I think it was originally a rather random image from, I think, 1920s language laboratory. I think he's just spotted it first and then spoke with some historian colleagues as well. Noticed that it's actually a composite image. It's a fake image. And it's really telling because it is exactly, in a way, the kind of hypothesis is that it's telling for perhaps that historical period, but also the ways in which we want to think about labs, for instance, or some other creative spaces, whether we call them labs or not, as bustling with activity, as people doing thinking, they're talking, they're communicating, they're in constant interaction, interdisciplinarity, whatnot. Because otherwise, labs and workspaces and offices look really boring. People sit there, they do things, it's quiet. It's not really actually a lot of activity. So you need to make them look bustling. It's a bit like you need to perform knowledge. This is what was mentioned so many times as well, but there's something really instrumental about the ways in which performing knowledge or knowledge functions relates to the imageries. That is a question of art history and visual history and many other kind of ways in which it feeds to perhaps, again, processes of formalization of what we spot as work, right?
I think it's what I think is super interesting, you know. Lab is short for laboratory. It once was.
Yeah, exactly.
But at the same time, it's an informal, casual abbreviation of a serious word. And in making that transgression, it has actually come to signify something completely different, because the associations that I have with a laboratory is an empty space with, you know, chemical substances coming dangerously, people with gloves, and you know, all but a loving, cuddly interaction, and the lab invokes almost the opposite associations, while it's actually short for the longer word. And I think that embedded in that is some of the confusion that is deliberately being put at play here.
And there's something really telling that, besides the fact that we try to put it back to the kind of axis of histories of art and histories of science, and their spaces, there's actually something that is really at the core of the ways in which work is being reinscribed through images, but also performances as well, and then financialized, for instance. Anyway.
It's Fred now, and then you got to stop us because we continue forever.
Give Fred the last word.
We find ourselves fascinating, so very quick point to Paloma's point. So inside Facebook, full-time people employed directly by Facebook, there are no unions. The unions are only for contract workers, and they've been aggressively organized. And one of the reasons that they've been organized is the differential in pay. It's simply astonishing. Someone who guards the automobiles at Facebook might make $15 an hour. Someone who drives an automobile, a starting engineer, would make well north of $100,000. And so the differences are simply astonishing and are managed in that way. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is that Facebook workers are, like other workers in tech sector, most valuable when they're young. And as you were pointing out, you get tired, you get old, you have families, the 24-hour work, you know, the hackathon that you have to go to because it's sort of required, very hard to do. And so the Facebook workers are subsidizing their high salaries with the money they put into their educations, with their youth, and I don't know how it ends. The company's too young to know, but when they get to be our age, my age, I don't know. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of short questions. I think that's helpful, so we can be also precise.
Lights.
Yeah, and maybe we can change a bit the lights, a bit less on us. On the camera, I see like 50 bottles in this perspective. We're getting thirsty. Yeah, we're running out of water here.
I need to empty very soon.
Yeah. How workshoppy.
I feel you.
Okay, so maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, I'm on the phone already. Thanks for the inspirational talk, first of all. Maybe I have a short comment, and then you might like it or not. I thought these first offices we saw in the photos, they were influenced, or they were showing us or remembering us on the times of industrial production. Industrialization was kind of the form of even of a creative office in that time. And now, in times of digital age, digitalization gives us or presents us or whatever this deindustrialization where we really have industry. And this industry is swallowing the private sphere on the one side and then is taking over artistic surfaces in this new industrial life. That means the artistic, in a way, is disappearing. I mean, this thing, everyone wants to be an artist, is already history. If you are working with young students at the University of the Arts in Berlin here, for instance, or so, you find out the young artists, they don't really have an idea. They don't have an utopia at the moment. They want to be successful. They want to be producing. It's these creative industries have taken over that space, and therefore we find the artistic or leftovers of it, or maybe a rest of an utopian space, more in the margins. And I felt this was very interesting in that project about Liverpool. Also, that there is actually, we find destructed places. Also, there might be a rest of real creativity, not a creative industry. And these are. Comment on that? I'm ready now. Yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks.
No, I think it's an interesting point about Liverpool, and one of, it's a project that we came to, if you like, already many decades after it had been fermenting because of the sort of its political history, and because there'd been a lot of residents who'd been working to try to save their neighbourhood. But I think what's important there, and in a way, again, I think comes back to the thing I didn't quite pick up with Fred earlier, and maybe on the point about a lifetime of play and what that's value is I think what perhaps I didn't communicate clearly enough about that project is that the community are a tremendously politically active community. They're an organised, politically active community who have a sense and have a set of mechanisms through which that they know they can make an impact. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't been sort of, hammered by government for many years, but they have a set of tools, and they have the knowledge within themselves of how to act, if you like. And I think that's where, someone raised in the audience earlier about the point of childhood and the image of the kindergarten, and also about what can a lifetime of play perhaps give you. And I think that was, if you like, the premise of my talk, which is that it can give you the tools to help envisage how you can alter your own or your community's spatial future. So, we all know of education as sort of, at its sort of, basis as sort of a reading, a writing, arithmetic. But I do think for a society that is as visual and as physical as ours, those elements of education are tremendously underrepresented, and increasingly increasingly under threat. But actually, I think, for me, what Granby demonstrates is what a lifetime of play and a set of tools can begin to equip you with in order to conceive of alternative options.
What I think is interesting, you spoke about the first image. I'm just presumptuously assuming it's the first image I showed. That is a space that looks like a factory but isn't. That is the 1950s, and what people do there is invent buildings. What people do there is draw lines with sharpened pencils on paper, which then go to the flat desk where they are checked by people with red pens for a mistake, etc. But essentially that was a space of invention. The whole point is that it looks like a factory but isn't, depending on what you defined as a factory. What I think is a huge mistake is, in a way, the whole discussion about Fordism and post-Fordism, to see computers as the end of industrialization. I profoundly disagree. Computers are the next level of industrialization, whereby the process we have set in motion, in the end, makes us redundant in a weird way. And there, I think, that I think is the tricky thing, that this holy grail of man's achievement in this leisurely world is just a very well concealed step in the process of further industrialization.
Right.
And that's where I think the Bauhaus is completely relevant. Is in a weird way because I mean, people talk about new politics, people talk about a new era. I am always struck by how much the issues remain the same, even class.
Right.
Another question?
Yeah, or more of a comment. I mean, you've spent a lot of time looking at the change of the workspace, of work in space, and the new relation between the formal and the informal. What I find slightly odd is that you've almost exclusively looked at a very tiny slice of space, which is the offices of the corporations from which this change of labor in space and formal versus informal is originating, but very little at the spaces where these changes are actually, where the results of these spaces are exhibited. If I look at, I mean, in a way, if I look at the designs of Springer, you have the 100% disciplinary, 75, 25, 100% control, whatever, these different modes of doing formal and informal. To me, I think we're really stuck still in we just see what it looks like, and it looks like different textures. I know that the output of Springer, what comes out of that building, is not going to change if you make it 25, 27, or 27, 25. This, to me, is texture, but we don't ask ourselves, what do these people who either play mini golf or sit in these boxes like caged animals, what do they actually do? What do they produce? And a lot of these companies produce exactly, they take a given form, a given infrastructure, and exploit as the differential in informalizing these existing given forms. Take a company like Facebook that takes commodified social relations and then implements commodification at every step. Take Uber or Airbnb, take like transportation, travel, accommodation, and radically informalize Amazon, warehousing, etc. I think if you don't, it would be much more interesting to look at as informal space informal spaces that are paradigmatic in this context, at spaces that we all know, like the restaurant that is not filled with clients but with delivering agents. The rental building that is not filled with tenants but with tourists. All these spaces there are at the end of that transformation, and it doesn't. To me, it seems like it doesn't change much if the team that designs this plays mini golf or sits in a row. It doesn't seem to be the most interesting space to look at to understand that transformation.
Rainier, I fear it's you again.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We designed an office building ultimately in Berlin, and I have a habit of talking about what I know a little bit of. But I'm under no illusion that the universe ends there in what I talk about. I see a lot of what you say, and I think the things like Airbnb and Uber are in a way further symptoms of something I tried to touch on in the beginning, the informalization of labor relationships, which strangely leads to a deterioration of labor conditions and leads to even a deterioration of pay. There was an interesting article in a Dutch newspaper actually yesterday that spoke about millennials as a better educated, supposedly more fortunate generation than the previous, who will invariably earn less than their parents, have less secure conditions, and etc. In economic standing, in a way, mark a regression. So I think it's largely evidence of the same. I'm sorry I didn't look at more, but I only had 20 minutes and a building.
We can have one last question, but I think we also
can go, no?
Protestant ethic-wise, our super egos would be fine if we stop now. But as I don't see too much, I just thought I asked. But if that's not the case, then thanks a lot for all of you. I think.
Make an announcement.
Yeah, the announcement. So there's an announcement. Make the announcement for afterwards.
So after this panel, we will take about 30 minutes to change the space, and we would like to invite you onto stage for a spatial experiment for informal knowledge exchange. So the plan is that we create 2 big tables where the speakers will be sitting and where you can join them for discussions. And in many ways, what we try to propose is quite similar to the kind of knowledge production spaces we create in the Alps. And there will be organic wine and food that is produced by the people that we work with locally. So it will be discussions and food and drinking. And we will have one table dedicated to spaces of knowledge and one to technologies of knowledge. And there are only 2 rules afterwards, which is that no question is too simple to ask to the speakers, so feel that even the most basic things can be asked in an informal setting, and that at each table there will one chair needs to stay empty. So when someone wants to join the discussion, someone sits down and someone else gets up and frees up a space for a free flow. And of course, there will also be food and wine for those who don't sit at the tables and just want to mingle and maybe ask the curators what all the work here is about and so on. Okay. So please join us afterwards.